Hey folks, Amanda here. Just a quick heads up that from time to time, the Survivor's Guide to Thriving podcast does include some adult language. So if you've got kids with you, you may just want to hold on to this episode to listen to a little later. Enjoy! Welcome back to the Survivor's Guide to Thriving podcast, the show for people who are ready to break out of survival mode in order to build a truly thriving life. I'm Amanda Sollman, and along with Mark Jewell and the rest of my team here at Mark Jewell Speaking and Training, we break down common roadblocks that keep people stuck surviving and share ideas to help you thrive each and every day. So if there's one thing that I have discovered here in the last few months, it's that we have several people on the MJST team, not just me, who are big fans of Brené Brown. If you have not seen Brené's TED Talk on the power of vulnerability, you definitely need to get on it. It's something like one of the top 5 TED Talks of all time, and it is good stuff. A few weeks ago, I actually talked about her book, Rising Strong, and how that pairs up well with the story framework we teach here at MJST. But today we are going to be talking about her newest book, Dare to Lead, which is all about vulnerability and courage and leadership specifically within organizations. And like I said, I am not the only Brené Brown fan here on the team, so I am excited to be joined today by Wade Johannes and Staci Martin to talk about the book. Hey guys.
Hey, Amanda. Excited to be here.
I am too, Amanda. This is going to be fun.
Awesome. Good deal. So just out of curiosity, obviously we're all kind of fans, but I'm curious, which Brené Brown books, there's an alliteration for you, have you two read before? Staci, which ones had you read?
I have read all of her books, actually. I know. I have. She was introduced to me about a year and a half ago through, I think it was her TED Talk, and then she was on a podcast that I listened to, and I said, I have to learn more about what she's doing. And I started digging in, and I think, Wade, you and I actually made one of our initial connections of, hey, we can get along working together over some Brené conversations. The first time you and I sat down to talk, I randomly brought it up and said, hey, have you ever heard of her? And Wade lit up and was like, I have actually. And we went from there. So I've dug into all of her books.
I think actually, Staci, you're going to get the 10,000 bonus points for having read all the books, because I have read, I'm currently reading, I Thought It Was Just Me, but it wasn't, or however that's phrased. I thought it was just me, but it wasn't. And beyond that, I still have Gifts of Imperfection to read. So I read Daring Greatly, Rising Strong, Braving the Wilderness, and now Dare to Lead in entirety. Wade, what about you?
I'm the slow one of the group. So I started, let's see, I was introduced to Brené Brown material probably a year ago, maybe a little bit more than that, on the TED Talks. And they had such a profound impact on me. Like Staci said, I just wanted to learn more about her body of work. And so I've only read, I Thought It Was Just Me. That was actually one of Staci's recommendations. And now obviously Dare to Lead.
So the reason I ask is, I'm guessing we're going to have some people listening to this who have read some of her books before, and you will probably hear some familiar things, right? I think all of us could probably attest to, especially probably Staci, since you've read them all, that these books build on each other, and I think she does a really good job of layering concepts on concepts on concepts. And I think key to this book that we're going to discuss today is, I guess Staci or Wade, feel free to disagree, but I really felt like it was a culmination of her work so far, just applied very specifically to corporate and work settings. She's talked about family and, parenting and just individual things in the past. This is just a really nice application to leadership and working environments. Would you agree?
Amanda, I would agree wholeheartedly to take that from her, from some of the stuff we're going to talk about today. But absolutely, it's a good, as you said, culmination of all of the books in a very different way. And it's practical. It's practical for leaders. It's a practical approach to how can we take all of the great research that she's done and her team has done and use it in the workplace in a way that I don't think is being done otherwise.
Agreed. So here's how we're going to go about doing this. We're going to kind of run it panel style. So each of us had some homework before we got on here to record, where we're gonna each pull our top 3 takeaways from the book. And so we're gonna kind of go round robin. We'll share some additional thoughts on each other's ideas, and we'll see what kind of goodness we can come up with. So one thing just before I jump into the first one, I guess I should say. This is not a paid advertisement. Brene Brown doesn't know who we are, although if she'd like to, we'd be more than happy to hang out with her. But this is just, we really like her work. We see a lot of application to her work in the work that we do. And it's always fun to deepen the body of knowledge. So that's the setup. Let's go ahead and dig into this stuff. So Wade, you are up first. What was your first top takeaway from the book?
Yeah, so even though this is only the second book of hers that I've read, I am very familiar with what she has available online, different podcasts and audio recordings and that kind of thing. And like you said just a minute ago, this is kind of the culmination of all of her work that she's done over the last couple decades. And I was only, 6 or 10 pages in, and I immediately understood this is a book everyone needs to read. Like I've read hundreds of books over the last few years, and as soon as I got into the first 10 pages, it was obvious to me everyone would benefit from reading this information. And so it connected with me automatically. And then it kind of made me think, because just talking with leaders across any industry, there's a lot of talk about strategy and, Six Sigma. There's a book that was out just a few years ago called Traction that, very process oriented and getting a lot of raving fans about it. And that's all well and good. This is about the people stuff. And this is the thing that you have to get right for your organization to move forward. And I was actually talking with a leader a couple of weeks ago, and they had brought up the old Dale Carnegie book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And it was written in 1936, okay? And it's considered by pretty much everyone to be a top 10 self-help book of all time. And it's things like, don't criticize people, give your honest and sincere appreciation, smile, things like that. And you think, how simple is that? But yet, when we talk with leaders, that's the stuff that's missing. It's almost 100 years later, and that's still the stuff we're not getting right. And so to take this book on Dare to Lead and to really internalize it, I think it will help anyone, regardless of what position you are or who you are or what you do. It will make you a better person just simply through self-awareness.
One thing I think is interesting, and I think Brene points this out at some point in the book, or maybe I'm just making this up, but it is a different way to think about leadership for so many leaders. I think many people who manage organizations have been taught, and I think these are valuable skills, but we've been taught, that strategy, right? The process, the nuts and bolts, the numbers, the spreadsheets, like if you can manage that, that's what makes a business successful. But I think we would all agree we're either transitioning into a new type of work environment, or that type of work environment people have always wished it was there and it just wasn't, right? I'm not really sure which is the root cause, but I think you make a good point, Wade, that this type of thing, talking about vulnerability, talking about shame, how to show empathy in organizations, those are critical components of leadership. And in all fairness, they're just components we've never really taught leaders how to exhibit in the past.
Yeah, there was a point in the 1980s, 1990s where Peter Drucker was the guru for everything leadership. And he had really good information, just very intelligent, great communicator, a number of great books. That was then. And now when you look at the points of differentiation, it comes down to people and our ability to connect with people at all levels. And so, yeah, I think, it reminds me of an article that I came across here just a few weeks ago that we can share in the show notes. But it's entitled "Self-Awareness is Worth More Than an MBA Degree," and that's the piece that we're missing out on until we lean into it through resources such as this.
Yes, that's a really interesting idea, and we will definitely link to that. Wade, one thing you said there at the end about learning how to work with people, I think is a really good segue into kind of what Staci thought was a key takeaway. So, Staci, I'm going to transition over to you. What was a big takeaway for you from this book?
And it wasn't only just from this book, it was from having read all of her books and then seeing it come through in a different way in Dare to Lead. And that's that it comes down to people. You can take titles away, you can take company goals away, you can take any matrix that a company has established. And for so many years, as both you and Wade have already pointed out, that's where a lot of the focus was of we have to produce, whether it's a product or a service. And the people side of it was something that just came along with that, as opposed to focusing on the people side and what that could do to influence the production side. And the reality is we are all people. And if we stop paying attention to that, I personally think we stop really, truly leading. We can peel away titles. In particular, I had an example that I came upon recently of this, and that is a CEO that I know has a very strong faith, and so they're really involved in their faith community. And so does a stay-at-home mom that I know. And when they go to one of those, in this case, it happens to be a faith-based meeting together, those titles don't matter. They're people. And so often when we walk through that door, or the proverbial door, if you're a mobile work environment like we are, but you walk into a meeting, whether it's virtual or in person, titles all of a sudden become an issue. But if we were to walk through the same door with those same folks at a school meeting or at a community event or a volunteer opportunity in your community, those titles wouldn't matter. But for some reason, when we walk through those doors, those titles become a barrier. And what Brené really does a good job of doing is breaking it down to the fact that we are all people, and we can't ignore the human element and what comes along with that. And if we're going to be effective leaders, we need to always keep that people first mentality.
Yeah, just to piggyback off of something that Staci said there, we had a guest speaker at church yesterday, and they were talking about how as much as 20% of pastors are in burnout stage. And the things that he was describing, just like Staci said, we could absolutely just take off any title. It could be a stay-at-home mom, it could be a CEO, a salesperson. It doesn't matter. The symptoms, the stuff is all the same. And my message for him was, let's go to work now. Let's not wait for that point to start going to work on ourselves. And so, absolutely. I mean, this applies to anyone in any area of any industry.
And one of the great things about Dare to Lead is, as hopefully anyone listening, if you haven't read it, you'll take time to read it, is throughout the book, they highlight key takeaways and key definitions. And one of them that really jumps out at me that goes along the lines of this is around leadership. And just to quote the book, Brené talks about leadership is not about titles, status, and wielding power. A leader is anyone who takes responsibility for recognizing the potential in people and ideas, and then has the courage to develop that potential. Anyone can do that. You don't need a title tied to that to be a true leader. And that's where it's that core foundation of people. And everything she talks about throughout the book is all based on people.
Well, and I think that realization is, to your point, really core, because I think a lot of times the reasons we don't engage in vulnerable conversations or in hard conversations or in sitting with someone when they're really struggling is we let those titles or we let those things that make us feel different from them kind of stand between us, right? And real leaders recognize that, they might be a salesperson or they might be a CEO or they might be an administrative assistant. They can still, in all of those cases, be a parent who's struggling with something at home, or can be the new kid on the block who feels like they don't know what they're doing, right? Like those titles, the corporate hierarchy doesn't change some of those core feelings that just as human beings we all experience at some point in time. And so recognizing that there's a shared humanity among us is really core to experiencing that daring leadership that she really builds this whole book upon.
Yeah. And just to build on that, Amanda, Wade and I both mentioned moms who are staying home with their kids. It's a perfect example of a title that sometimes gets misconstrued about the true leadership that's happening. In fact, I get goosebumps as I'm talking about it. And I think of people close to me that stay home with their kids. I just want to give a shout out there because we're talking about leadership, and I don't think often enough we think of those who make different choices in their life and go down a path that makes sense for them and their purpose at that season of their life. We don't often think about them in that same leadership realm enough. And so just wanted to give a little shout out to all the stay-at-home moms out there, because Wade and I both mentioned you, and I put you right in the camp of being amazing leaders, and you're leading within your home and in your communities.
Awesome. And if you're a stay-at-home dad, the same thing goes for you.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Definitely.
Awesome. Good deal. Well, so good stuff. So people, everybody, we're just people. Let's talk. Let's work through stuff. Which I guess to some extent leads to my first aha, or maybe it's more of just I don't know. This when I think about what stood out most to me in this book, I keep going back to empathy. Empathy. Now, this is not the first time Brene has talked about this. She's been writing about shame from the very first books that she wrote, and her big thing is like empathy is the kryptonite to shame, right? Empathy is the thing that can counteract shame most, and empathy is key for creating vulnerable conversations that are productive and helpful. And so she talked some about key skills to practicing empathy. I always appreciate reading because she says it every time that empathy is a skill that can be practiced and learned and improved upon. Because I will say it's probably not something that comes as naturally to me. I know we have some colleagues and many of you out there who are just naturally very empathetic. This is one that I get to learn. But what I really found helpful was when she talked about what she calls empathy misses, or where, as leaders, we have the opportunity to show empathy, to create true connection with one of our colleagues, whether it's parallel, whether it's a direct report, maybe it's somebody even above you. We have the ability to show empathy and create connection, and we miss. Right. And I know I have been in this situation before. I'm sure I'm not alone. And so just a couple of, she lists a whole bunch of these empathy misses, but two that I found really interesting, and we've talked about this, is sympathy versus empathy, right? I think those are easy to mix up. So as she defines it, quote, empathy is feeling with people, sympathy is feeling for them. Right. And so empathy is really being able to sit side by side with somebody and say, I know that this sucks. Right. Like, or I know that this is tough, rather than I'm sorry this sucks for you, or right. Like that's more sympathetic and it is less helpful. So I thought that was really, really interesting. One of the valuable pieces of that she talks about is the importance of boundaries when showing empathy and sympathy, right? You can imagine a world where it's easy to get right into somebody's problems with them and not be able to get either of you back out. And so the importance of drawing clear boundaries. But for me, like practicing, okay, am I being sympathetic or am I being empathetic here? And how can I show more empathy? The other one that stood out to me is what she calls the gasp and awe. I don't know if you guys have ever done this, but somebody shares something that was just like a really sucky experience. And you're like, oh my gosh, that's terrible. I can't even imagine, right? Like, and you just blow it up and they're like, well, it wasn't actually that bad, right? And so now they're consoling you because you blew it up to way bigger proportion. I think that's when I can fall into just, trying to connect with somebody about an experience and you kind of make it bigger than it has to be.
So empathy is just like anything else. The more we use it, the better we get with it. So, if you think of courage, if somebody has courage, but they never use courage, they never have the opportunity to exhibit courage, how courageous are they? We need to step into it and try things and learn from them and practice them so that when the time comes, we are more adept at knowing how to apply it and how to come at it from the appropriate measure.
Yeah. And I think you call it a good point. And I can't remember if it was in this section of the book or a different section, but she talked about something she calls grounded confidence, which I think actually is a newer term in this book versus some of the other books. But it's the idea of like, I'm going to screw this up. But the way I get more confident at it is by coming back to it, trying it again, improving, trying different things and getting better at it over time versus just like a confidence that either comes from ego or being naive, right? Just thinking you know everything. And I really like that as it comes to empathy because I think as leaders, as anybody really, there's going to be times where we're not going to do it well, right? Like we're either not going to be empathetic, we might not even be sympathetic, right? Like, or we might. I find myself being guilty of this. We might, in an effort to connect with others, kind of pivot attention accidentally. Like, so I think that we're all kind of on a journey to learn and get better at this skill because it's not something a lot of us come with naturally.
But when you do try something and it doesn't work, or that it didn't come across the right way, own it. Just say, I'm sorry. When last time we were together, I said this. I don't feel like it came across the right way, and I just want you to know that I'm sorry, and I'm going to try harder next time.
One thing, just last note here before we go back to Wade. This is kind of a long quote, but it really, I went back to my copy of the book and I had literally like highlighted this entire page of stuff. And I'm going to dice it up. But one of the things that I think comes in both when you're practicing empathy, as well as maybe when it doesn't go as well, is the importance of in that and in so many situations, assuming the best intentions of people. And I think so often in work situations, we assume the worst, right? Like they meant to screw up or they meant to talk to you in a way that you don't like, or they meant to do X, Y, and Z, right? And one of the really profound things that Brene talks about, and I'm just going to go ahead and quote it. She says, quote, daring leaders work from the assumption that people are doing the best they can. Leaders struggling with ego, armor, and or a lack of skills do not make that assumption. As crazy as it sounds, many of us will choose to stay in the resentment, disappointment, and frustration that come with believing people aren't trying rather than face a difficult conversation about real deficits. Assuming positive intent does not mean that we stop helping people set goals or that we stop expecting people to grow and change. It's a commitment to stop respecting and evaluating people based solely on what we think they should accomplish and start respecting them for who they are and hold them accountable for what they're actually doing. End quote. And I think having the willingness and the skills to practice empathy in those cases where you think people are not performing to your standard, especially becomes really important. We don't know what's going on. We don't know what's happening behind the scenes that they haven't said. And so to always assume the best of intentions and then be willing to lean into that, I think is just, it's a really hard thing to do. Like, I don't want to underestimate how difficult it is to lean into those conversations sometimes, but that was one that, man, my highlighter was going full bore. So now that I went on that very, very long quote and very, very long spiel, let's go back to Wade. Wade, what was your second takeaway from the book?
So this is one that these are conversations I've been having with coaching clients over the last couple of years, but we need to stop celebrating being busy. We need to stop rewarding the people who put in 110 hours. And I get the fact that in agriculture, there's times when people do have to go above and beyond. But I also know that it's part of the culture, and it can become addictive where my work isn't necessary now, but because my peers are still in the office, I'm not going to be the first one to leave. And that was something I guess I wasn't expecting her to talk about in this book, but I was very impressed that the way she came at it. But she talks about another quote that she made from somebody else, but they talk about the opposite of play is not work. The opposite of play is depression. And that hit me like a ton of bricks because, if something in some cultures, if something doesn't contribute to the bottom line, it's a waste of time. And that can only go on for so long before people are burned out, before they are, leaving your organization. And so it's important to create space to have fun, to celebrate the wins, to get to know and build the relationships with the people around you so that when times do get tough, you have a stronger relationship you're working from. And I guess I just really appreciate Brene highlighting that because, as I've said for the last several years, busy is not the goal.
And when being busy for the sake of being busy becomes the norm, you're on a really dangerous path. And we're going to talk about shame in a little bit, I know, Amanda, because that's where Brené's start is in shame research. But one of the things that I've witnessed over the years with company cultures and those that particularly are focused on busy, even if it's for the sake of saying you're busy, is that there's a level of shame that comes if you actually aren't as busy as or is perceived to be as busy as everyone else. So you're not going to let your guard down. And when someone asks you, how are you doing? You're going to say, oh, I'm really busy. I've been so busy. I'm busy. You may or may not be, but you don't want to be the one who's not busy. And it's a dangerous path. It's really a culture that, like you just mentioned, Wade, it's okay for maybe a short term, but over time, you're going to start burning people out, and maybe even people who aren't really busy because they don't think they can keep up with the perceived busyness. And so they're trying to go more when they maybe even don't need to be.
I think it's interesting that in Silicon Valley, these high-tech companies have unlimited vacation time, but nobody dares use it because anybody that uses it is looked at as being weak. And then they are soon vulnerable to be laid off. And that's a sick place to get to when your culture is that bad, where people don't feel good about taking time off. And then one thing that to kind of add into that, if you cannot get away on vacation or time off and just without your phone ringing off the hook, that's not about your significance, your importance. You are not developing the team around you. You are not asking for help. You are not being a strong leader if that is how you set up the people around you in your absence.
I think that is a really important point, Wade. We don't leave often because we're afraid of what's going to happen. And if you're afraid of what's going to happen, if you go on vacation for a week, like, either you don't have the right team around you or you haven't been doing the work as a leader to build up your team. Like that should not be a big deal. And not that you shouldn't prepare those folks for when you're going to be gone, but I think that's a really key point to hit home.
Yeah, and most likely you have not empowered people to make decisions. So anything that comes up from a customer, call my cell. Well, you're training people that not only are you not worthy of time off, but you don't trust them. Whether you say it out loud or not, you're telling them that you do not trust them with these decisions. And that is, we see it all over the place, and it's sad, but it's the reality of it. So once again, building up the people around you, connecting with them, helping them to grow and to get better, but also turning over the decision making so that they can do what they see as best.
And Wade, just to build on this, and I know that you're not suggesting this, is by saying that we shouldn't celebrate busyness, it doesn't mean that you're suggesting that people shouldn't work hard. There's a difference between being busy and digging in when you need to, and digging in and giving the extra effort when it's necessary. It doesn't mean that has to sustain day in, day out, all year long, 52 weeks out of the year. It means allowing yourself the time then to step back when you need to, and then digging in again where it makes sense, when it makes sense, when it's necessary.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was working with an agronomy team, and, in the spring, in the busy season, it's very easy to put in over 100, 110, maybe even 120 hours in a week in certain positions. And I was talking with a senior leader who was talking, was going through that with his team. And he shared vulnerably with me that his job was done, but his team was still there, and he didn't feel right going home. And so he stayed, and we talked about it, and we talked about, the message that he's communicating with his team through that. But yeah, I mean, it can be addictive, because when teams go through that together, in the short term, there's a greater sense of connection when they go through that extreme circumstance. In the long run, though, oftentimes it comes at the expense of what matters most in our lives.
So some words have come up here in the last few minutes of our discussion that I think really go, Staci, to your next takeaway. And so I'm curious what that is.
That's looking at the foundation of authentic leadership. Authentic leadership is one of those terms that we hear thrown around a lot. And I don't know, myself included, that I really took time to think about what is authenticity. What is an authentic leader? And for those of you listening, I would encourage you even to pause right now and just take a second to think about, what is an authentic leader to you? Some key characteristics. Write them down, or if you're driving, don't do that. Just take a second to think about it, and then unpause and come back. But the focus of this book, and to me, the authentic leadership that comes through in the end after you complete it, is that it's a combination of vulnerability, values, and not only knowing your values, but living them and exhibiting them to others and honoring them, courage, trust, and wholeheartedness all combined. And we could dig into each of those terms, Amanda, but I know we don't have time. That's probably a whole podcast in and of itself. But each of those areas, vulnerability, values, courage, trust, and wholeheartedness, to me, is what comes through as authentic leadership after digging into Dare to Lead.
Being the same person on Wednesday night golf league as you are Friday night, as you are Sunday morning, whatever day of the week it is, but being your authentic self and encouraging other people to be their authentic selves as well.
And to me, the real courage in organizations is honoring authentic leadership. And too often it's not happening. And in fact, on page 73, Brené points that out, where she talks about that we give lip service to the idea of bringing your whole self to work, yet the organizations that actually allow employees to do it are few and far between. And then she goes on to say that she doesn't see a tremendous amount of meaningful, actionable support for integration and wholeheartedness in most companies. And so even the term authentic leadership sounds easy, but when you really start to dig in to leaders bringing themselves to an organization, it gets tough, because vulnerability is tough. And vulnerability means you're putting your piece of yourself out there that you normally wouldn't do. And there's likely some fear that comes along with that. But when you have the courage to put yourself out there, with boundaries, of course, but to put yourself out there, it goes back to the beginning of our conversation, where you're making the people connection. And if you're a CEO who can share an experience about a child, or share an experience about a loved one or an elderly parent, or whatever that experience is, and do it in a way that makes sense for you and you're comfortable with, it allows you to be vulnerable. You're now going to make a connection with your team in a way that you wouldn't have done before.
So 2 thoughts on that. One, I think it can be easy to think that vulnerability or being an authentic leader is like, it's this extra thing that I have to do, right? We have all this stuff we got to get done. It's busy. Things are crazy. People are going in a million different directions. We got financial budgets we're trying to hit, there's all this stuff going on. Oh, and now you want me to share authentically and vulnerably, right? It can be easy to think it's this extra thing that seems real woo-woo on top of everything. But I think what stood out to me is that it's not an extra thing as much as it is small decisions that we make every day, right? So when that colleague lets out a deep sigh after you assign them a project, and you recognize ooh, there's something in that deep sigh, instead of just saying, oh, do you have any questions? And when they say no, you walk away, saying, okay, I noticed that sigh. What's going on? Or can I support you through this? What else is on your plate? How can I best support you to get this done in addition to everything else? Or whatever. Or maybe they say, that sigh has nothing to do with work. And it's just my parents are ill and I'm trying to figure out how to get that taken care of along with everything else at work, and whatever it is. But it's in those tiny moments of interaction with the people that you work with, of choosing not to just walk away, but to recognize that there's something there. And it might be scary, but you might create or deepen a relationship that you never realized could have existed just by one single tiny choice throughout the course of your day.
Amanda, I think that's a really good point. And so much of what's learned in this book, it can feel like another thing, like you talked about. But really, if you break it down, it's just incorporating what you probably already have inherently inside of you, but for some reason maybe have a protection up or have been taught not to demonstrate. And whether it's taking those small moments and building on that. In fact, she talks about trust, and that trust isn't that one big thing. Trust is built over time, and it's built in small increments. It's built in small steps. It's built in into small interactions. And the same goes for vulnerability. I would wholeheartedly agree with that. There's that wholeheartedly again. I've read the book too many times.
Yeah, I'd like to add on to what Staci just said. I think just taking in this information, you can't help but be more empathetic to the people around you. I mean, it's going to show up in how you show up. And it's not one extra thing you need to do, but it's how we do the little things over time where we build that reputation, that character.
So my next thought, I guess, actually kind of builds on what I was saying in the example about watching for signs from your employees, or from people around you, even from yourself. One of my second takeaway from the book was how important it is to really hone your skills of being able to recognize shame, whether that's in yourself or in other people. Okay. Brene talks in earlier books about how most of us are never taught how to deal with shame, right? We're very much taught that emotions are often things you tamp down and don't deal with, or in some cases that you just let blow up and control you instead of you controlling them. And so many of us, when we feel shame, right, when there's an emotional reaction to something, we don't know how to work through that. And so in that, she quotes a researcher by the name of Linda Hartling, and she talks about what they call shame shields. And there's another alliteration for you, shame shields. And she talks about 3 different ones. So one is moving away, which is withdrawing, hiding, silencing ourselves, and keeping secrets. One is moving toward, which is seeking to appease and please. And another is moving against, trying to gain power over others by being aggressive and by using shame to fight shame. And I don't know about you, Wade and Staci, but I feel like I have seen all 3 of these exhibited in organizations at some level. And I definitely, as I read through there, went, "Oh, that's what I do," right? Like we each have some of these things that come out for us. But I just think if you are going to be a strong, daring, authentic leader, one of the things that we need to get better at is, oh, when am I going into shame mode and I'm doing some of these things? And then when do I see that in my peers and in my employees that, oh, there's something going on there? And we really need to dig into that.
So Brene talks about how there's a level of shame in every organization. There's no organization is free of all shame. And I really appreciate how she lays it out there. But she said, shame is hidden behind the walls of organizations. It's not dormant. It's slowly eating away at innovation, trust, connection, and culture, but it's tougher to spot. And so she made a list of signs of shame. And it's things like gossiping, back-channeling, comparisons, perfectionism, harassment, power over, bullying, those kinds of things. And those things need to be called out. So, if you want shame to continue, turn a blind eye or pretend it didn't happen. It's in the secrecy, where it continues to grow and manifest. But one of the things that I call out in coaching calls is when people use sarcasm as a defense mechanism. So when people are challenged to do something more, they have a funny thing to say and they laugh about it, but really they're hiding behind it. And that kind of thing happens very, very easily in any given culture. But what's interesting is she goes back to the Greek root of the word sarcasm, which I don't speak Greek, but the way I read it, it says sarkasian, and it means to tear flesh. And you think of sarcasm as tearing flesh, and that's awful, but that's the root of that word. And I think there's so much growth to be done when we shine a light on these types of behaviors and stand up as an authentic leader and say, this is not going to be tolerated anymore.
And Amanda, because I know not everyone has read all of her books or maybe hasn't read Dare to Lead, it's worth noting that within the book, Brene talks about shame being the feeling that washes over us and makes us feel so flawed that we question whether we're worthy of love, belonging, and connection. And think about that as we're talking about shame. And as you're sitting across the table from someone who might be feeling that they're not worthy of love, belonging, or connection, it's worth taking that moment to be vulnerable and try to make that connection.
If that's how you feel, good luck hitting your sales numbers. I mean, seriously, to bring it back to a real application, if that's how somebody feels, I don't care what their job is, they are not going to do it at a high level if that's how they feel inside.
And that has come up both in this book and I can't remember which, but it's come up in some of the earlier books too, is how amazing it is that we have all of these companies and company leaders who say, yes, I want my employees to take risks. Yes, I want them to innovate. Yes, I want them to try new things. And yet we have cultures where people are afraid to speak out. And in some cases, where they're afraid to speak out for legitimate reasons, because maybe we use shame to fight shame, right? Where, a leader doesn't feel significant or important. And so therefore, when somebody else brings forward a good idea, we tear it down because we don't see that the people lower than us should have big, grand ideas, or, whatever that is. Any organization where shame is really thriving, and I don't like to use thriving with shame, but any organization where shame is really prevalent, to your point, Wade, like, don't expect innovation, don't expect risks, don't expect big things, because if we are too scared to do big things because we're afraid of repercussion, or if we're afraid of being ostracized or treated differently, right? That's that fear that we aren't worth belonging, connection, love. Like, we're not going to do big things because we don't want to look different or be put down for some reason.
Yeah, when that is if somebody speaks out and they get shamed in front of their peers or company leadership, and it does unfortunately happen, good luck getting everybody to row in the same direction. I mean, that's when, to your shame shields discussion, Amanda, that's when people just put their head down and try not to bring attention to themselves. And that is no way for any person or any organization to go through life.
And then what happens is the shame becomes more ingrained. It becomes a bigger trigger. And there are some major ramifications that can happen if we keep pushing shame down and ignoring it. And Amanda, that was my third takeaway from the book, if it's okay if I segue into that. And that's denying shame and its impact on ourselves and others is truly denying the full opportunity to lead, grow, and experience life. We can pretend like people don't have it. We can pretend like we don't have it ourselves. And when we do that, we're denying ourselves the opportunity to get vulnerable, to rumble, as she talks about in the book, to rumble with vulnerability and to work through things. But rather than we go into those reactions, then maybe we shut down, which then we're isolating ourselves. And in an organization, Wade, I think you made a great point when you said they like to see your sales numbers if you're not connected and if you're living in shame.
And, we're talking about this from, the company culture standpoint, but I think of things in terms of a ripple effect. So when I am having a bad day, I don't leave that. And as hard as I try, it's very difficult to impossible to leave that bad day at the office. And I'm speaking, in earlier in my career when that was a lot more prevalent. But, conversely, when I am thriving, when I show up differently, it's a ripple effect. That's when people can say, wow, there's something different about you. And they can start to go to work on themselves. And it doesn't just stop with me. Nobody works in a bubble. And so looking at the greater scheme of things, this is very important work to be done. And one last thing I'll say on this, one of my favorite sayings is, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And it's the absolute truth.
And I bet we have some shame naysayers that are listening. Amanda, what do you think?
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure there are people out there. No, shame is good. This is how you get people to do things.
Or I don't have it. Or I don't have it.
Or, oh yes. Or
I don't have it.
I don't have shame. Not at all.
So can I go a little personal here versus work, but it all carries together. And I think that's part of wholehearted living. To be fully honest, so I'm a 20-year depression survivor. I battled depression starting in early adolescence on. And it wasn't until I thought it was just me, but it isn't, the one that I think, Wade, you just completed it. And Amanda, you're digging into it right now, aren't you? All right. It wasn't until I read that I fully was able to label what was still there. So I haven't battled depression for a while, but it's always with you. If you've had depression over a long term, it's something that's always there, whether it's active or not. It's still there. It's part of who you are. It's part of who your life has been, or what your life has been. And it wasn't until I read that book and was able to truly label shame that I could really go to work on myself. And I'm proud to say that I dug into my shame. And I wish 20 years ago I would have read a Brené book, because I probably would have had a little different life experience. But, my life experience got me here today. So that's where I am, and I'm going to embrace it. But once I was able to label the shame and really look at it and be honest about it. And that was the key. And that's why I brought up our shame deniers out there, because it wasn't until I got honest about the shame that I was carrying that I could then go to work on it, deal with it, learn how to work through it and address it, and then take my life to a whole new level. And I can honestly say it was a game changer for me. I am not the same person that I was, because I finally looked at what was at the core, and it was shame. And it changed my life. And so if you are a shame naysayer out there, I think it's important to get honest. It doesn't mean that you're at my level. I obviously had some other factors in the key, and I got professional help that worked through it, and I was happy to do that, and it changed my life. But we can't deny that people, I don't care who you are, everyone has something that triggers them. Everyone has a story and a trigger, and that a lot of times is centered or a foundation of shame. And we just have to be honest about it and be realistic about it.
Yeah, that's a powerful message, Staci. Thank you for sharing that. That hit home with me, because I've got family members and loved ones in similar situations, similar scenarios. Excuse me. The thing that I want to bring attention to is the fact that when we talk about shame, it's not like we go down into the shame and just stay there. It's like you put on your mud boots, you go down into it, and you walk out the other side and keep going. And when you do that, it is incredibly freeing to move beyond it. I've heard several people say that, I've got this corner in my soul that we're just not going to go there. And, that's fine. But, when you do, that's when you have the opportunity to let go of the extra weight, the extra baggage, and level up and move forward with your life and not let that hold you back. I guess in my experience, it seems like whenever people face that and work through it, that's when they level up in all areas. Does anybody else have any other experience in that?
Yeah, I would agree with that, Wade. And I think the key here too is you do it in a way that makes sense for you. That shame comes in different shapes, forms, and sizes for everyone. And admitting it, and then, like you said, walking into it and then walking out of it, you do it in a way that makes sense for you.
Which you guys just we are right here at the end of our time, and you fed me right into my last point. And so I just want to thank you for that was some real skill in segueing right there. Good job. But I think what Staci and Wade, what you've been saying, really just highlights the importance of a skill that Brené refers to as the rumble. And Staci, you mentioned that just briefly before. And I think, so in a nutshell, right? So if any of you listened to episode 77, where I talked about rising strong and compared that to the story framework, this idea of the rumble is why her book Rising Strong has been one of my favorites so far, just because I think it is something that so many of us can use. But in a nutshell, right, the rumble is when, oh my gosh, I'm feeling something. Now it's time to dig into it, figure out what it is, where is it coming from, and then deciding, okay, now what do I do with this information? And this applies in so many situations, right? So Staci, you shared a situation where that was really relevant to you personally. But it is just as important within teams and organizations. One of the quotes from the books is, quote, "We can't expect people to be brave and risk failure if they're not prepared for hard landings." Right. And this is a conversation I have with people in coaching all the time. I feel like I'm constantly saying, if there's one thing we don't teach people, but this is one of them. And one thing that we don't teach people well is how to have hard conversations and how to have hard conversations without leveraging shame to do it. Right. I think there are situations where maybe as a leader, you go, oh, I have to have a hard conversation with this employee. But what that really means is you get to tell them what they did wrong and they just have to deal with it. Right. That's a shame driven conversation right there. And what I think we as leaders, what we get to learn ourselves and what the people around us get to learn is how do we have that rumble? Within our teams, within our organizations, how do we say, whoa, something's not going well here? Maybe people have stories in their head about what somebody did or what a situation meant. But the norm is just not to talk about it or to talk about it in side conversations with people, right? This is the gossiping and back channeling that Wade was mentioning earlier. What I think is really cool about this book is Brene walks through a super detailed process for rumbling as a team, for calling out what we're seeing, for calling out, why do we need to deal with this? Because the reality is, like, we're going to be in situations where we're telling ourselves stories about the people we work with, about the situations we're in, right? You can think about all of these companies that are going through mergers and acquisitions. We're telling stories about what that means. Sometimes it's behaviors, and we tell ourselves those stories whether they're true or not, right? So the gossip starts. We fill in the blanks when we don't have information, whether that information is true or not. And so I think if you can, whether you read through the book or you just get the excerpt or whatnot, that rumble process can help teams figure out what's true and what isn't, so that we can come to a better solution at the end that's not self-blame, right? It's not, oh my gosh, I'm just such a screw up, I can't figure out how to do this right. And it's not about blaming others, right? It's not about, oh, so-and-so shouldn't have done XYZ, right? We're really trying to say, hey, as a team, we all understand that everybody's just trying to do their best, but something's not working here. So let's really dig into it and figure out a way to the other side. And if organizations and teams can get better at that, I think the level of trust and as a result of that, courage, risking boldly, taking, doing, innovating in different ways, like that will rise because they know their team has their back, whether it goes well or not.
Yeah, I think of a couple of conversations I've had with senior leaders in the last year, and it's kind of, well, yeah, we know that's important. We will do that when we get a positive bottom line. That's when we'll reinvest in those people development type things. And it's like, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? In our experience working with MJST, coaching clients all across the country, when people know that they can trust the people around them to work through the good and the bad, that's when the magic happens. That's when you take the lid off of these teams and off these organizations.
Well, we are here very much at the end of our time. I knew we all talked about this before we jumped on. We knew we were going to take the full hour because there's so much good stuff in this. Like we said, not a paid endorsement, although, hey, Brene, you want to come hang out with us? We would welcome you any given day. But I think the bigger message is we all got a lot of value out of this, and would really encourage folks to pick up a copy if this sounds like it might be your type of book, because there's a lot of other good things we didn't even get to. So, final thoughts.
Just choosing courage over comfort. That's a big takeaway from the book. And as leaders, we all need to be willing to be a little uncomfortable. And it's going to open up doors for us if we're willing to do that.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode. If you like what you heard, make sure to jump over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and review. We appreciate the feedback, and it helps other people find the show. On that same note, if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to share it with a friend. As always, if you're looking for more resources to go from surviving to thriving, check out our website at www.markjeweltraining.com. That's Jewel with 2 L's. And you can find us under Mark Jewell Speaking and Training on all the major social networks. Remember, survival is dead. It's your time to thrive today. See you next week.